Well, let's begin at the beginning.
Welcome to Armchair History here at the Saint Albans Museum. My name's Alex Lehning. I'm Executive Director here at SAM. In this episode, we're previewing our brand new exhibit called Farming Franklin County, which is all about the agricultural history of Saint Albans and the surrounding communities. I'm really excited to be here today with Don McFeeters, who's one of our board members and has a long history in agriculture, to talk more about the exhibit and what we plan to do in the coming months. So Don, you've got a strong background in agriculture, a strong background in this community. You've been involved in FFA, working in agriculture. You have your PhD in the field, so you've sort of seen it all. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about some of the things you've been involved with.
I was brought up in the town of Sheldon on a farm, and went to school in Sheldon Springs, school that no longer is there, and then came to BFA here in St. Albans and was actively involved with the ag program here at BFA and the FFA program. Ended up as a state officer, and then went on to UVM, got my degrees there, and then ended up at Michigan State as with a graduate program out there. Ended up working for the University of Vermont for 30-odd years. I left the University of Vermont and went to Ohio State University and ended up my career with the Ohio State University. I also, as I ended my career there, I took on a role on a part-time basis with my college fraternity, Alpha Gamma Rho, and worked with undergraduates with leadership development, organizational development kinds of things. Worked with the young men that were in college. I've been doing that for the last 10 years, traveling the country, visiting in numerous campuses, and seeing some of the outstanding young men that are developing and coming through the college system today. So I've seen it from a variety of different places. Started my career with the UVM here in Franklin County as an extension agent.
One of the reasons we're excited to share this with you, and one of the reasons I'm glad you're here today, Don, to share your perspective, is that this really touches on a variety of aspects of our community history. Agriculture is about economy, it's about society and social things, it's about the way we do business, it's about the way we kind of connect with the land and the working landscape. So really excited to start bringing this exhibit together. And one of the things I wanted to talk with you a little bit about is how St. Albans has been known as an agricultural leader through the years. So at various times we've been a lot of things, right? We've been the butter capital, dairy capital, maple syrup capital. So we sort of have all these designations that really talk about our relationship to these products and the people that produce them and how we served Vermont and Greater New England. And I wonder if you could just maybe touch a little bit on the impact that St. Albans kind of had in those areas.
St. Albans is the focal point, but it's milk, maple coming from all the farms in the surrounding areas in Franklin County. Franklin County is a grass producing area, and so that really, from a historical point of view, was the foundation for dairy. We were able to grow top flight grass, and we'd end up getting milk that would be brought into St. Albans. And back in the 1850s, when we were the butter capital, the trains allowed us to ship milk into the greater Boston area, southern New England. That's where the population. At that point in time, or when I started work here 55 years ago, there was 30-odd thousand people. We had way more milk than we could utilize here. So we had to export to southern New England. And so in the early days, it was butter, and then as time went on, we started to deliver fluid milk in a bottle that went south. And so it became the dairy capital, the largest producing area, although Addison County would contradict that and say they're larger than we are. It was one or two, depending on how you wanted to look at it. Then on the maple side, maple is is a intricate part of Franklin County. It is, this is the largest producing county of maple in the country. We do not compete with Quebec. Quebec is much larger than we are, but in the U.S., this is the largest producing maple. And historically, we had most maple operations were associated with dairy farms. So you had dairy that you ran through the year, and then maple was what you did in the spring that gave you money for taxes. And over time, Leader Evaporator was here, the major equipment operator or producer. We also have had maple processing, manufacturing of maple products here in Saint Albans, all coming from the maple farms here in the county. Now, what's evolved is maple has become a much larger size operation, and many of the operations today are not associated with dairy farms, but they're their own standalone operation. So, and the technology and the science has changed a lot in maple as it has in dairy. So Maple Festival was created in the 30s here, went out of existence, and then it came back in the late 60s as a way to promote maple, to provide an education for maple. And we did the same thing with dairy in the Enosburg Falls area with the Dairy Day. So both of these major enterprises were an intricate part of the community. They provided income to the community, it energized all the businesses here in St. Albans, because the dairy and maple producers would bring their checks into St. Albans banks. It also, agriculture provided the community base. It provided people for the community organizations, for town offices. Town leadership came from farmers and farm families. So it became a very intricate part of farming, became an intricate part of the community throughout Franklin County. And then here in St. Albans was the base of much of the agricultural business. And I describe agriculture as the farms, the agways, the Worthmore companies, and many other companies that exist. St. Albans Co-op certainly is one of those that have continued, have been here for a long time, and is the mainstay of the economy here in St. Albans.
I think it's very important that you touched on the way all those various aspects sort of integrate into the community. For those of you who were with us in a previous episode of Armchair History, we talked about St. Albans, the rail city. So it's really interesting to see that connection, how the railroad allowed us to be a regional and a national leader for some of those products. If you recall the story of the Saint Albans Raid, which was the famous Confederate attack here in 1864, the raiders planned the day of their bank robberies around Market Day, because they knew if it was Market Day, there would be a lot of people in St. Albans. It would make them harder for them to achieve their objectives. So they actually scheduled the raid on October 19th so that it was not a day when a lot of the agriculture producing families would be in town, either selling or buying or transacting their business. So it's interesting how that sort of has that really integrated impact on some of the stories that really define our community. You mentioned a lot of people and organizations and how it sort of fans out from St. Albans and as well as the other Franklin County communities. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit maybe about how farming, how agriculture has changed, and maybe some things that have stayed the same over the years.
Yeah, farming, I'll speak about farming, the farmers that are out there. There's been considerable change. If you go back way in time, the farms are totally subsistence. Really, everybody was on the farm. That that was how they started. There may have been a few people in town doing other kinds of jobs, but it basically, the farmer was producing food for his family and a few of the neighbors. And as time has moved on, we began to get some smaller farms developed that then became where there needed to be a market. And that's how farming, the market of farm products is done by cooperatives to a great extent. Farmers use cooperatives, means farmers own the cooperative, like Saint Albans Co-op is owned by the farmers that ship milk into that. And so as time evolved and farms kept getting bigger and bigger, and I should say dairy farms kept getting bigger and bigger, and fewer number. So the landscape has changed. It used to be almost a farm every mile on the road. And I was just counting up when I was in high school, coming down 105 to BFA, from Gallagher's Corner up to Green's Corner on 105, there's 7 farms that do not exist today. Now, the land is being used and probably increased level of production on that land, but the farmers that own that are living in a whole variety of different towns in the county. So that's been one of the real change. So 50 years ago, there'd been 7 farmers and their families that would have owned farms. So the landscape has changed. Production per acre, production per cow has increased greatly.
I assume technology is involved in that.
Technology, science, nutrition. Today you figure out, what are you going to need for production? Production's based on the number of pounds of milk that cow is producing, the butter fat, the protein level, and then you figure out how much protein and how much energy you need, and if there's mineral balance that needs to be added in. So the science of farming today has greatly changed dairy. And if you look on the maple side, it used to be a few taps, a few being, if you had 1,500 taps, that might be looked at as fairly sizable. Today, you got 30,000, up to 75 or 100,000 taps on some operations. It used to be all done by horses and a sled. They would collect the sap, and put it into a tank, and be hauled off to the sugar house, which would be evaporated. Today, you see tubing run up and down in the woods, and there's these systems are on a vacuum is created, and so this sap goes off to the sugar house all by tubing, much less manual labor. And then you have reverse osmosis equipment that takes out a lot of the water, so you don't have to end up boiling with using wood or whatever other product or whatever other fuel that you might be using. And so it reduces the amount of boiling time, the amount of energy that it takes, all with technology. Technology's been created. So this technology's been created by public universities. All have a agriculture research system. The private companies also have research facilities. And research is a continuum all the way from the cellular level, which probably is going to be done at public institutions, all the way up to the applied arena, and where the private companies get involved in some of that. So today, these farms are very science-based, and as well as they're very business-oriented. You've got to end up with a profit at the bottom line, or these business is not going to be able to sustain itself.
It's easy to imagine the practice of farming as sort of this art where, you know, the farmer knows his field, you know, and sort of has this intuition about, you know, his plants and his animals, which is somewhat nostalgic, but also, you know, has a bit of truth to it. Interesting to see how we've made that shift to where this sort of really applied scientific economic analysis has to factor in, and how we've sort of moved from the concept of the family farmer or even the co-op to sort of agribusiness as we know it today. And it's interesting you mentioned like the reverse osmosis machine. So even though technology is rapidly shifting and what's happening on the farm and in the sugar house is a lot different than 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when you look at the marketing for it, there is still that idyllic vision of what it is to be a Vermont farm product. So, you know, the maple syrup jug, I'm thinking, was sort of the classic image of the sled and somebody in a flannel shirt and the sugar house and those sorts of things. That's what people are buying into a little bit, even though the image on their syrup bottle doesn't necessarily represent kind of what's happening.
There's been some changes from that. Most of these farms today are still family owned, family operated. They may be incorporated in some cases. In some cases, they're partnerships, so there may be other business arrangements, but they are. You got to use some practical insight. There is an art, but ultimately the business side ends up, you know, controlling whether or not you are able to sustain yourself. And very true. The marketing aspect is probably focused much more on the older traditional way,
pastoral view of
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what people like to hear and see. Now, that's where some of the new concepts are coming in: the organic production, the natural foods, locally produced, the farm to plate, all concepts that are evolving and developing that are new today. 20 years ago, some of those concepts really were not in place, but I think it's taking some of that traditional and trying to mesh it into some of the more contemporary thinking.
Well, I want to definitely talk to you about the exhibit, but before I get to that, just a couple quick questions. One, we talked a little bit about the railroad, and I'm wondering if you can give us some insight on how the arrival of the interstate to St. Albans impacted the agricultural community.
Without the railroad, the railroad was in existence that provided ways for us to transport milk and dairy products, but it also was a way of bringing in grain. Grain is what's fed to dairy cows, and grains from the Midwest, the West, brought in and processed here in St. Albans. The Worthmore plant on Lower Weldon Street, where the police station now was a major processing of grain, and the railroad allowed that to happen. So it was both on the railroad provided a vehicle for us to move it from the west and then sending dairy products out. The interstate then became the railroad. It became a mechanism to allow us to ship milk, and you'll see tankers leaving St. Albans Co-op, and they're heading for Boston, or they may be heading to Pennsylvania or New York, Western New York, with milk for fluid. Fluid is what you buy in the store, or it may be for yogurt plant in Western New York, or other kinds of processing plants. So the interstate allowed that to happen.
But it also displaced some farms, isn't that true?
We ended up having to compete with Western U.S. because we now ship milk and other stuff by the interstate. And so we're now having to compete, and unfortunately, the Western lands are more competitive than we are. And so we struggle with that because there's a lot of excellent land out there. If you go out into Idaho and Utah, you've got a lot better weather conditions. You can truck in alfalfa, and the interstates allow us to move milk from anywhere in the country and allow us to move grain anywhere in the country. Consequently, we do not have as many farms as we once had. We have some larger farms. I would argue probably we produce as much as we did 50 years ago, maybe even more. But it's a different, done on different farms, different size farms. The interstate has played a major role in the development, in the marketing, and the bringing in inputs from other places.
And where they built the highway actually goes through what was farmland, right?
Yes, that's a good point. That if you leave St. Albans and head towards Swanton, there's a number of good farms that the interstate went right through, and we can go to a variety of other places in the state where the interstate took up farmland and changed the farming in that area very dramatically.
Well, before we get to the exhibit, one last question. You've given us a great overview, Don, about sort of the working landscape and the socioeconomic landscape and kind of people and production and this really great base understanding of what agriculture means to this community and how it impacted us in so many ways and has for so many years. I guess I'm just curious, as someone who's been involved in agriculture as part of your life's work and growing up in the area, what do you see as the future of agriculture in Franklin County?
That's an interesting question. I think agriculture is going to continue here. It's going to be extremely challenging. There are some opportunities. My anticipation is there's going to be a fewer number of dairy farms. In some cases, we may see some even get larger. Some of these that are smaller in size are going to need to find some niches, find some other ways of doing things. I spoke about farm to plate, organic production, natural foods. I think we've got to find some things there. We've got to look for ways to add value to some of the milk on the farms. There are some farms that are adding artisan cheeses, for example, and can we find some ways to, and so I think there are some things that can happen here. The maple, that's the same kind of thing. Can we find some things that we can make some adjustments? Ultimately, we've got to find a way to make sure that the challenge is that the farms have to be productive. They got to be financially stable. They can't function without meeting financial requirements. They're also got to be environmentally sensitive, and they've got to be socially acceptable. And those may be the two biggest challenges of farms as we go forward.
There's definitely that balance of environment and production and economy. I think you're right, though, that the Vermont brand is something that's strong and it's going to continue to be strong, and that we're very fortunate to have. So I know our time is short. I definitely want to wrap up by talking a little bit about Farming Franklin County, which is the new exhibit. We're sitting here with some artifacts that are going to help make up this brand new display. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about some of the elements that it's going to include and what we're looking for in terms of input from the community.
I view the exhibit and maybe the museum as a whole. We're storytelling. We're to tell stories about things that happen in the community from a historical perspective as well as what's currently happening. So I look at this ag exhibit as a way of telling a story about technology and time and science and the story of agriculture, farms, and the agricultural businesses that have existed here, is to be able to describe what has occurred over time and what's occurring today, is to try to demonstrate the importance of the agricultural community to this area and some of the historical avenues that it's taken, and maybe even get us to think about what could be in the future.
So as we're looking to friends in the community, all of our viewers out there who may be interested in this topic or want to contribute, what sort of items or stories are we looking for?
We're looking for any photos that give us some sense of the history. It could be photos of some of the businesses, Ingleside Dairies, Rushlow Dairies, for example. It could be some farm practices or some photos of cows or of barns or other agricultural practices. It could be some of the businesses. H.B. Hood had their cottage cheese plant here on Main Street. Any of those kinds of photos. I've seen some photos of farmers in the old days bringing milk by can into what we call receiving stations. That's some history. So we're looking for photos. We're looking for some artifacts, and we're realizing we can't deal with larger artifacts, but smaller ones.
Great. Well, Don, I think you've given us a great overview on what agriculture means to our community. I really appreciate you taking time, sitting down with us in our armchair and talking about some farming Franklin County history. Thanks so much.
Glad to do that. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Armchair History here at the Saint Albans Museum. Had a great time talking with you about our new exhibit, Farming Franklin County, and all about the agricultural history and heritage of our community. If you have anything to contribute, please be sure to contact us at stamuseum.org or give us a call, 527-7933. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.